Thank you. Siseko Kumalo holds an honors degree in philosophy and political and international studies from Rhodes University and is currently reading for his Master of Arts in Philosophy at UP. Mr. Kumalo's area of focus has been in education, decolonization within the South African context, and has subsequently co-authored a paper with a Canadian scholar investigating decolonization in South Africa and Canadian contexts. He has published with Education as Change and Critical Studies in Teaching and Learning. He is an editor-in-chief of the Journal of Decolonizing Disciplines. He also sits on the Executive Committee of the Philosophical Society of Southern Africa and is a Mandela Rhodes Foundation Scholar for 2017. Please join me in welcoming Siseko Kumalo.
Brilliant. That was a bit of a mouthful, wasn't it? I'll try and not bore you guys with this stuff. You know, as a philosopher, it's always quite interesting. Wow, the lights are bright. Darn. As a philosopher, it's always a very interesting thing when we do these talks. But I'll try and not bore you with the stuff, and I'll try and make it as exciting as possible. Where do I press? Brilliant. Excellent. So this presentation was inspired by a paper which was just cited right now that I did with Critical Studies in Teaching and Learning. And the paper was titled, Explicating Abjection, Historically White Universities Creating Natives of Nowhere. In the paper, of course, I was dealing with the said question of whether or not these historically white universities, i.e. institutions such as Rhodes University, the University of Pretoria, WITS, and UCT, to mention but a few, create natives of nowhere. Now, what do I mean by the notion of creating natives of nowhere? These universities fundamentally do something or create of an individual who can neither identify with their native subjectivity in terms of their native identity, nor can identify with the colonizers or colonizing master's identity, which is that of the colonial settler descendant, who consistently reminds blackness and indigeneity in our midst that it will never be the colonizing subject. One of the reviewers, of course, then inspired this analysis by pointing out that even as I was dealing with a sense of ontological reclamation in terms of blackness and or indigeneity reasserting itself within historically white institutions, my work was still fundamentally premised on white or canonical speakers. One of those, of course, was Jean-Paul Sartre, where I use his treatise on being and nothingness, which was foundational to my work. In this talk, then, I trace how decoloniality becomes in parenthesis, coloniality as it continues there, right? And I do this, of course, by showcasing how this stuff necessarily relegates blackness and indigeneity to the role of the indigenous subject who is still on the periphery in our context. Okay? So in tracing decoloniality then and how it becomes decoloniality, I start by looking at the demand that was made by the students, which was the demand for a decolonized curriculum. Okay? Now, this decolonized curriculum, we witnessed institutional instability, which highlights how the Western canon is so prized in the contemporary university in South Africa. Now, this response to this demand for decolonial curriculum saw institutional instability, and the response was the use of police, riot brigades on universities, and university administrators in consort with the administration threatened the use of the South African National Defence Forces as and when it was necessary. Okay? All of which, of course, were to be deployed against students. This, of course, we saw as the use of legitimate state violence by the contemporary South African university. And it signaled the death of academic freedom as we know it. Students inspired in us, the intellectual and academic community, to reimagine curriculating strategies within the contemporary university. And of course, this meant that we were supposed to be speaking from outside and bringing in a canon that was outside of that which is prescribed. The counter-hegemonic charge that we got from students, of course, meant that we were supposed to invite scholars and writers who were writing back and speaking back to Western modernity. speaking back to Western modernity, and of course the status that while the male knower, the white male knower specifically in the university, would be challenged within the contemporary university. As a result of this tension between legitimate violence as well as democratic violence being used in our institutions, blackness and indigeneity asserted itself using democratic violence within historically white universities. The intellectual community was subsequently required to rid itself of the docility of oppression, which culminates in decoloniality as praxis. Now, decoloniality as praxis intimates back to Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, and more pressingly to Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Decolonial praxis invites an even larger, and I would suggest more insidious tension within the contemporary university, as it speaks to this idea of a contestation of knowledge and asking the question of whose knowledge actually counts. Resultantly, within the contemporary higher education system in South Africa, we have two violences that we saw. We saw the manifest physical violence that witnessed black bodies within the university being criminalized, being incarcerated, and being surveilled within institutions of higher learning, specifically historically white institutions. And of course, this is a phenomenon that we still see even on this campus. On the second front, of course, we've got what we call epistemic erasure, the erasure of knowledge systems of African peoples. And this happened, of course, in terms of the systematic delegitimation of the knowledges of African peoples within our context. However, before I get into a detailed understanding of the question of whose knowledge really counts within the university, I wish to paint a picture in terms of how it is that the Black archive in our context becomes delegitimated in contemporary higher education in South Africa. First of all, coloniality is a sure thing, with blackness in terms of my own very existence, making of the university space a site of struggle, right? So that's the first move that happens, which necessarily indicates that coloniality is a sure thing, no matter how much we might try to wish it otherwise. The second move that happens is the question of who exactly gets heard and writes about coloniality, or decoloniality for that matter. And in the third move, it is the white male knower who claims to speak even on behalf of indigeneity and its subjectivity that gets heard. In the fourth move, of course, we then see the white male knower, specifically even in the South African context, becoming canonized as the legitimate knower, while those who are speaking from the periphery are silenced as illegitimate knowers. The fourth and final move, of course, is that there are particular modes of existence which are then legitimated, and those that are denied legitimacy, what I otherwise call in my scholarship ontological legitimacy, which is what we see of black bodies and indigeneity within historically white universities. These bodies are seen as lacking ontological worth within the university space. We are not even seen, right? And when we are seen, it's through the camera obscura of the contemporary day and age, that is the camera that watches and criminalizes how this black body moves about within this space. And of course, that all culminates in the delegitimation of the Black archive. But who exactly is the Black archive? The Black archive consists of Eskiam Pahlele, Benedict Vilakazi, Tio Soga, and S.E.K. Mqhayi, to mention but a few. In Mqhayi's Ityala Mawele, Mqhayi in the introduction does something quite wonderful in the novel. He says, "Kweli balana ndizama ukubonisa imigudu nexesha elithatyathwayo ngamaXhosa xa elandela umthetho kuba kaloku kuzanyelwa ukuba uzekelwe kwisibakala esake sakho." Okay? He says, ndizama ukubonisa ukuba inkosi ayisingiyena mgqibi wezinto yedwa, njengoko izizwe ziba zona kunjalo kuthi. Intetho nemikhwa yesiXhosa iyatshona ngokutshona ngenxa yelizwi nokhanyo olukhoyo oluze nezizwe zasentshonalanga. Right? And that is, of course, he is lamenting here. He is basically, what Mqhayi is trying to do is that he's trying to showcase a jurisprudential analysis of how it is that in Xhosa cosmology we adjudicate matters using inkundla, which is otherwise known as the arbitration center, which is the king's palace. Right? So in Ityala Mawele, he then, of course, laments the death of Xhosa cosmology, specifically owing to the imposition of Western knowledges and frameworks within our context. Now, in response to Mqhayi's concern, I am interested in scholars who are writing from and with the oppressed, right, as intimated by Paulo Freire's work in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This denotes developing a decolonial praxis or decolonial teaching methodology, which is rooted in the Black archive, specifically in our contexts, okay? Rooting teaching methodology in the Black archive begins to rescue decoloniality from colonial strategies, while further delimiting the chances of historically white universities creating natives of nowhere that oscillate between their native identity and subjectivity, as well as the white colonial descendant futures, right? As a mode of resurrecting or rescuing decoloniality from decolonial in parentheses, strategies of reforming higher education institutions, I would suggest that blackness in our context adopt the Fanonian position, which says of the white man and whiteness, in fact, I do not give a damn for him. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Siseko Kumalo, and thank you for your time.